The gales of November that blow across America's Great Lakes every year have claimed thousands of ships and lives over the decades. Some of these ships, like the Edmund Fitzgerald, have reached legendary status, and they continue to evoke mystery and fear in us. Their stories paint vivid images of the power of the lakes, and they make us wonder what the sailors were thinking in their final moments as they watched the waves swallow their ship. These are stories that continue to intrigue us because we try to envision what happened and what it must have felt like. There were no survivors or witnesses, so we use our imaginations to create our own reenactments, so to speak. In rare cases where someone does manage to survive, for instance the Carl D. Bradley where 2 crewmen survived, the story is certainly remembered, but it doesn't exactly captivate the public's interest in quite the same way as when a ship disappears with everyone on board. Maybe this is why the story of the Mataafa has largely been forgotten over the years. There's no mystery, and there's no romanticizing what happened. Everything that unfolded during the pre-dawn hours of November 28, 1905 was brutally real. Unlike other freighters that are lost on the open water without another living soul for miles around, the Mataafa disaster was witnessed by thousands of people who could do nothing but watch as Mother Nature's fury battered the ship and her crew. It's a story of how one ship became 2 totally different worlds after breaking in half. For the 15 crewmen in the front, the Mataafa was a shelter. For the 9 crewmen in the stern, she became a death trap. All told, the Great Lakes storm of 1905 sank or destroyed nearly 30 vessels and killed 36 sailors, but the storm's most public victim was the Mataafa, hence why the 1905 storm is often referred to as the Mataafa storm. Over the course of 24 hours, the storm would wash 14 steel carriers ashore. The Ira H. Owen, a 278-foot-long carrier bound for Buffalo, New York, sank with all 19 of her crew. The wreck has never been found to this day. Another steamer called the Western Star was thrown so far ashore that people were able to walk around the whole ship. The Mataafa storm isn't the deadliest weather event to hit the Great Lakes. That honor goes to the White Hurricane of 1913, which killed some 250 sailors, the majority of them on Lake Huron. But the Mataafa storm would make 1905 the deadliest year in history on Lake Superior, and it struck with such ferocity in terms of the snow and cold that its power has stood the test of time for more than a century. Today, we look back at the story of the Mataafa and the overnight battle for survival that her crew endured. For the 9 men in the stern of the ship, the prospect of warmth and safety taunted them just a few hundred feet away as their bodies froze and their faces turned cold and gray. At just 32 years old, Captain Dick Humble already had 16 years of experience sailing the Great Lakes. Like most freighter captains, he was confident and he trusted his gut, which, on this day, November 27th, was telling him it was time to leave. For several days already, he'd listened to the storm warnings from the Weather Bureau, but he and his crew were growing restless. Captain Humble's bosses at Pittsburgh Steamship, who owned the Mataafa, were also encouraging him to get a move on, though for liability reasons they were also quick to tell him to exercise caution and to not put his ship in any danger. In truth, time was money, and the sooner Captain Humble could leave, the better. Around 3:30 that afternoon on November 27th, the 430-foot Mataafa left Duluth Harbor bound for a port in Lake Erie loaded with iron ore. In tow was the 366-foot barge, the James Nasmyth, which was also filled with ore. For 12 hours, the Mataafa sailed, and most of that time was probably spent regretting the decision to leave Duluth Harbor. Just a few hours after leaving, the waves and snow grew stronger. Cupboards flew open, causing plates to shatter across the room. Waves busted portholes, flooding the crew quarters with slushy lake water. In the pilot house, Captain Humble and his wheelman, George McClure, kept their eyes on the barometer as it dropped, indicating that the worst was yet to come. Outside, waves continued to wash over the hatches as ice formed on the wire railing. Anybody unlucky enough to be caught on deck would have been swept overboard in moments. By 5 o'clock the following morning on November 28th, Captain Humble made the call to turn back toward the safety of the Duluth Ship Canal. The crew, who just hours before had been urging Captain Humble to leave Duluth, were now ecstatic to be going back. They cheered at his decision, excited to see their families for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, and they were also probably looking forward to sleeping in a bed that hadn't been soaked in freezing water. By noon, they could see the silhouette of Duluth through the snow. As the storm worsened, 4 ships, including the Mataafa and Nasmyth, were now making their way to take shelter in Duluth. Crowds began to form at the piers to watch the drama unfold as these 4 huge vessels attempted to dock with 80-mile-per-hour winds and monster waves slamming into them. From the shoreline, onlookers could see the Mataafa approaching with the Nasmyth in tow. Captain Humble aimed the Mataafa for the 300-foot space between the 2 piers, which stretched 2,000 feet out into the water. With a beam of 50 feet, the Mataafa could have normally maneuvered into the ample harbor with ease. But with the waves and currents battering the ship, Captain Humble knew there was no way that he could maneuver both his ship and the Nasmyth between the 2 stone piers that lay ahead. Humble ordered the Nasmyth to be cut loose, a decision that he didn't take lightly, as he assumed the smaller barge would be powerless against the storm and destroyed against the rocks. As it would later turn out, the Nasmyth and her 9 crewmen were able to anchor and ride out the storm unscathed. As the Mataafa maneuvered into the 300-foot gap between the stone piers, Captain Humble watched as the shoreline grew closer and closer. With the ship about halfway into the dock entrance, a surge of water suddenly drove the Mataafa's bow down into the lake bottom, twisting her stern into the north pier. Captain Humble watched in horror as the Mataafa's lifeboats were crushed to splinters between the ship's hull and the stone pier. The storm surge then spit the Mataafa out of the pier entrance and spun her around with her bow now facing the open lake. By this point, the Mataafa's rudder and most of her propeller were gone, leaving the ship entirely at the mercy of the waves. With the ship powerless against the storm, the lake was able to deliver its death blow by throwing the stern into the opposite pier, where her battered hull finally gave in to the elements. The cracks that had been forming at the 8th hatch began to widen as the ship split into 2 pieces. Waves crashing into the Mataafa's wounded hull turned red from the ship's cargo of iron ore, giving the appearance that the ship was bleeding. Freezing water quickly doused the boilers and poured over the men taking shelter below decks with unforgiving force. As the ship flooded and settled into the floor of the lake, the Mataafa stopped rocking, which must have come as somewhat of a relief for its crew. But any relief they felt was short-lived, especially for those who had been caught at the back of the ship when it broke up. The temperature at this point was 13 degrees below zero as snow, ice, and thousands of gallons of slushy lake water soaked them to the bone. The men caught in the stern knew they had to somehow find a way to get to the forward part of the ship. 3rd Engineer James Early and Fireman Carl Carlson hung onto the stern railing together, looking at the shore, which was just 700 feet away. Carlson decided it was now or never. He jumped for the pier as the other sailors watched him disappear beneath the waves. His body would later be found on the shore, still wearing his wool mittens. As for second mate Herbert Emig, he was tired of waiting. He was normally up front with Captain Humble, but he had gotten stuck in the stern when he came back to untether the barge line holding the Nasmyth. With the waves crashing across the deck every few seconds, Emig stood there, learning the pattern of the waves and calculating his next move. After watching for a few minutes, Emig finally squatted down on all fours and began making the 250-foot journey to the safety of the pilot house. For what felt like an eternity, the other men watched as Emig clung to the railing every time a wave tried to sweep him overboard. After several near-death experiences, Emig finally took cover in the pilot house. By this time, it was a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and already the late November sun was beginning to wane. What little warmth the sun could provide in these conditions was about to disappear behind the horizon. As darkness settled, the temperature would drop even further to 20 degrees below zero. 2 more men, Porter Fred Saunders and the coal shoveler Thomas Woodgate, were inspired by Emig and attempted to cross over. Despite waves sweeping Saunders' feet out from under him 4 times, he made it to safety. Woodgate was next. As a coal shoveler, Woodgate was the most physically fit of the men on board. His crewmates figured that if anybody could make it across, it would be him. The storm, however, seemed to grow more violent, as if ready to take on its most challenging opponent. A trio of waves known as the Three Sisters, each more violent than the last, attacked Woodgate as he made the journey. After the 3rd wave, Woodgate flung himself back on board and said, "No more," as he limped back to the stern of the ship, defeated. Despite seeing Woodgate's failed attempt, fireman Charlie Byrne decided to give it a try, knowing that if he remained on the stern, he was as good as dead anyway. Amazingly, he was able to reach the pilot house. Throughout the night, some 10,000 people gathered on shore to watch the Mataafa's fate unfold. They built bonfires and makeshift campsites where they cheered and gasped as they watched the crew make their daring journey across the ship, as if they were watching a theater performance. In the pilot house, Captain Humble ordered his men to wear their life preservers and to stay inside to avoid being washed overboard. Using his megaphone, he called out to the gathering crowd on shore for somebody to come rescue them, but the waves prevented the life-saving crew from getting close to the ship. During the night, Humble went below deck to find some kerosene and matches. He then took a hatchet and chopped up the wooden molding of his bathroom and threw the kindling into his bathtub. As the fire grew, all 15 men huddled around the tub, warming their frozen limbs and praying that rescue would come soon. Captain Humble ordered the exhausted men to stay awake by dancing, knowing that sleep would have been fatal. For several hours, the crew went back and forth, adding more wood to the fire. Around 7:30 the following morning, as one of the crew members was bringing back more wood, they spotted a boat approaching the Mataafa. The storm had finally died down long enough for the life-saving crew to approach the ship. Help was finally on the way. One by one, the Mataafa crew slid down the icy rope and into the 30-foot lifeboat awaiting them. At this point, the waves were already beginning to pick up again. It would have to be a swift rescue. Otherwise, the life-saving boat was at risk of being smashed against the hull of the Mataafa. Unfortunately, the boat wasn't able to take all of the men in one trip, but before they left, the rescuers left a picnic basket and a bottle of brandy for the men left on board, which included Captain Humble. The rescued men were taken to the nearby St. Louis hotel, where they were given warm food, cigars, and hot whiskey. On board the Mataafa, Captain Humble and his remaining crew couldn't enjoy the picnic basket left for them by their rescuers. Instead, they stared at the back of the ship where 9 more of their men were, and yet there was nothing but silence. Humble and his wheelmate crawled to the back of the ship where they were met with a grisly scene. The crewmen who had been stranded overnight, exposed to the elements without any source of heat, were now mummified in frost and ice. Their lifeless eyes were frozen open, staring at the shore they had so longed to reach. Deckhand Thomas McLeod was found nestled in the ventilator. In a vain attempt to seek shelter, McLeod had crawled inside, hoping to protect himself from the wind and waves. Thomas Woodgate, the coal shoveler who had attempted to reach the pilot house, was found huddled at the base of the smokestack, lying face up with his arms stretched out. He had been hugging the smokestack when he died. His body was tossed back by the wind and waves, freezing him in a state of desperate embrace. The chief engineer Bill Most and the steward Henry Wright were both found with serious head wounds, with Wright's frozen and contorted body found stuck in a hatchway in front of the smokestack. Walter Bush, the cook, was found trapped under a fallen ventilator. For hours, the life-saving crew would have to chip and chisel the victims free from their icy prisons. Their bodies were taken to thaw at the morgue, where thousands of curious onlookers gawked at their corpses, presumably curious as to what happens to a man who has been exposed to the elements overnight. 3 of the crewmen who had been in the back were never found. Their bodies had been swept overboard during the night. Back on land, some of the rescued crewmen seemed to prefer whiskey over food. The events of the last 24 hours left sailors traumatized and seeking the comfort of the bottle. Walter Crane, one of the deckhands from the R.W. England, was found drunk and wandering the streets at night until a police officer found him and arrested him for public drunkenness. The judge sympathized with the poor sailor, telling Crane that a majority of men would have committed the same offense under similar circumstances. Luckily for Crane, the judge suspended his sentence. Unfortunately, Crane didn't seem to learn his lesson. Upon leaving the courtroom, he almost immediately went to the bar with another sailor and got drunk. The judge's sympathy for Crane was waning at this point, saying, "Don't you think you are working this stranded sailor story a little too strong?" Nevertheless, he let Crane go with a $10 fine that would be waived if Crane left Duluth by that evening. For several days, the 100 stranded sailors from the various ships stumbled in and out of the local bars, commiserating with one another and missing their families. For the 15 crew who survived the Mataafa, that Thanksgiving was bittersweet. They were thankful to have escaped with their lives, but they grieved the loss of their 9 crewmates who were either lost at sea or being shipped home in boxes. Blame for the tragedy went back and forth. Some of the blame, of course, went to Captain Humble for attempting to dock in such violent weather. For his part, Humble was reportedly consumed with guilt and could barely eat or sleep in the days following the rescue. A lot of the blame, though, went to the U.S. Life-Saving Service, in particular, its captain, Murdoch McLennan, for not acting sooner. Others blamed the shipping companies for pressuring captains to stay on such rigorous schedules despite the bad weather that always came at the end of the season. In the end, there was no inquest into the deaths of the Mataafa crew. Accidents where sailors died in storms or other natural acts were not investigated, freezing or drowning was simply seen as an occupational hazard. In response to the storm, the U.S. Lighthouse Service began construction on the Split Rock Lighthouse, which now stands on a 130-foot cliff on Lake Superior. Near the lighthouse lies the wreck of the Madeira, one of the 29 ships that was lost or damaged in the storm of 1905. For the Mataafa, despite being split in two, her career was not over, far from it actually, and it would be a pretty storied career. In 1908, she rammed and sank the SS Sacramento in Duluth Harbor. 6 years later, she got damaged after hitting yet another pier. Despite the mishaps, the Mataafa overall had a really distinguished career and would play the role of rescue ship on several occasions, including a time when she rescued all 19 crew from a package freighter called the New York. In 1946, she was converted into a car carrier and would stay in service until 1964. She was finally dismantled in 1965, some 60 years after the Great Lakes storm that almost ended her career. The story of the Mataafa has long been overlooked in favor of more mysterious shipwrecks, but it's certainly one to remember. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you made it this far, please do give the video a like or comment so that other people can discover this story. If you're interested in learning more about the storm of 1905, I highly recommend checking out a book called So Terrible a Storm by Kurt Brown. I used a lot of the information from that book in this video. I also recommend Great Lakes Shipwrecks and Survivors by William Radigan and November's Fury by Michael Schumacher, which discusses the storm of 1913. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.